Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's great to see you here for our 2022 Research for the Public Good conference. This is our internal conference at APUS where we are highlighting faculty research that has been done and celebrating research in general at the university. I'm Jenny Douglas. I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies and Research, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today, or if you're listening to the recording, thank you for listening to that as well. I'd like to introduce our presenter this morning, who's Annessa Babic, speaking about a cultural triangle, empowered women and the traveler's gaze along the Aegean and the Mediterranean coasts. And I will let Annessa take it away.
Thanks. All right, so this started out as a project. Started out in like 2013-ish when I was in Bodrum, looking at a fishing village, and it's manifested from there. And when I started the project, I thought that I was looking more at empowering women and the perception of tourism and how that changes women's lives. And instead, particularly with the effects of COVID and what tourism has transformed into, particularly over the past 2 summers, the project looks more at, I guess you could say, why we travel to the places we do and why we long for those, with that women's narrative still being part of it, but instead it's more of a sub-narrative this time. And the reason that is because, as we all know, COVID changed us into a post-COVID world. And with that, I started doing the ethnographic research in Greece in 2021. And, that summer it was great. There was no lines. It was pretty much, wide open spaces, if you want to say. You could get flights last minute, hotels last minute. And then this summer, prices were about 35% higher for hotels and rental cars particularly. And you had to have things booked in advance. And the lines and the queues were very, very long. The summer before, I made a couple friends along the way of some of the people that I interviewed, and George is one of them. And I talk about him in a little bit here, but in 2021, he took half an afternoon to talk with me, and we walked around the Agora together. And this year he was like, there's no discounts this year. And I don't have enough people because there were so many people and it was so crowded at times. And that's really when I sat there and I was like, okay, so my project doesn't make as much sense now because the narrative's changed. So it's definitely, the women are still there. But with that being said, what I'm looking at is how the culture of travel, it manifests itself into this viable industry. And it's catered to and it's sought after with a lot of flourish and glee. I mean, we romanticize about it. We have an entire industry of travel guides, of the Travel Channel, and fiction and literature just abound on selling us a location and selling us an ideal. And this proliferation and birth of affordable airfare and hotels, and particularly with an Airbnb era, it creates an avenue of economic revenue that is largely unchecked. It's still understudied and it's really overlooked. And particularly with one of the things in here is, if somebody else wants to take this Airbnb venue, you're more than welcome. I'll give you notes, and that you could really build an entire whole genre of literature just on studying the Airbnb and what it does to local economies, particularly this year where I was at in Athens, because I stayed in an Airbnb both summers. And this year, almost my entire 2-block radius was all Airbnbs. And I found that out from my landlord because, I had coffee with him one day and we talked. And it's a big mix in the neighborhood of those that live there full time and those that see the Airbnbers come through. And that adds to this influx of tourism itself and of what happens to these global hotspots. And with these global hotspots, particularly in Europe, those celebrated on the Grand Tour, the old Grand Tour, they have now usurped local cultures and they force locals to flee as there's literally no room for them. And the price of real estate soars through the roof. And particularly in, urban studies, we look at this as gentrification. And you see this in every city around the world. I live in New York City, where you can hear the sirens right now because I live near a hospital. But I live in New York City, and we constantly fight gentrification on a daily basis. The joke around here, which is not really a joke, that once the Starbucks and the Target comes in, there goes your rent. And in Athens, what the joke there is, it's not that different as Gregory's, which literally translates out to fast in Greek. But Gregory's is one of the national coffee chains. And once a Gregory's comes in, you know that your rent prices are going to change. You also should look around and see if there's an influx of Airbnb, particularly if you're closer to city center. And when peeling apart the layers of this project, I started looking at it as, the kind of culture that we look for, particularly these old small fishing villages where this project started in Bodrum, Turkey, all those years ago. And looking at the regional intersections, particularly between Greece and Turkey, and a lot of the shared culture and shared food and even the style of architecture. And then I did take a short break and I went to Cyprus. And in Cyprus, you're obviously going to see a lot of the same connections there. Of course, in Cyprus, it becomes a little bit more complex because it's the farthest island of the Mediterranean. So being an American there was very odd because they don't see Americans there that often, particularly in the hottest month of the year. And with Cyprus, you saw a lot from the Middle East itself. But at the same time, you still saw this fascination of the chains, and you saw this dividing between the locals and those that work just in that tourist center and the kind of culture they want to sell. In each one of these instances, as I fleshed through all of this, you see that tourism really is a crush because it leaves a feast and a famine scenario. For 3 to 4 months of the year, it's boom, where your locals have little space of their own, but they work nonstop in many instances because that's where the majority of their income comes from. Whereas in the winter season, there's little, if any, work. And on the other side of that is that how much of the economy comes from tourism. In Greece, about 25% of their national economy comes from tourism, and that's declared economy. And if you know about the intricacies of Greece, there's a lot of off the books kind of merchandising and business. And so it's 25% officially, and it's probably closer to 35 to 50% depending on where you're at. Particularly if you're along the islands, you're going to see that it's going to increase exponentially up there. But you're also still seeing that for as many hotspots you have that are overtaken by tourists, you can still find the escape along the coastline or in a rural area. And with this, you have to wonder what part of the picture is reality and what part of the picture is not reality. And with that, this transnational project is looking at tourism of these Mediterranean coasts, and it's particularly trying to figure out, why do we still flock to the overpopulated area? And why do we still flock to the same places where we're going to buy our mass-produced trinkets? Like here on this last slide from Istanbul if you zoom in, you see that like one of the teas they sell is a love tea in the spices. And that's in Sultanahmet, the Sultanahmet neighborhood, which 12-ish years ago when I was there, it's very different than it is now. Now you've seen that it's largely been gutted, and there's a lot of box stores that are surrounding the old, historic market. And inside the market, it's endless. It's very cheap lamps that the beads fall off of. And, like the silver is not hand hammered silver, and it's not, that level that we know through lore and through experience itself. And on the other side of this is these cups and trinkets. These are endless arrays of these. And this was in the Galata Tower neighborhood in Istanbul, which 12 years ago, that neighborhood, when I was back there with my friend this year, we both looked around and we were like, this is so not how we remember it. There was still throngs and throngs of people, and it was really crowded. But at the same time, we were like, we remember it having a lot more of a local feel and not so much of a forced, these very expensive boutique feels. There was a lot of boutique leather vendors making leather wallets where you could watch someone make it in front of you. And my personal favorite that I can't find the photo of, probably because it's on another disc, but is of the French coffee shop over there with the lavender seats, where next to it, you go to your Turkish coffee shop for literally half the price. But why did the French coffee shop have such an abundance of people, particularly in an economy that is struggling, particularly with the Turkish economy? In August, when I was there, the conversion rate was 18 to 1. So 18 lira to $1. I mean, good for us is bad for the Turks. But you saw an endless array of people, but it wasn't Turks there that was at the Parisian coffee house, nor was it Turks that was, shopping and buying these trinkets. And instead, it was a lot of those out of what we would consider the Middle East proper, and then Europeans. And that comes back to that striking matter of the fact of, do the locals buy these products anymore? They're considered, traditional Turkish products or traditional Greek products. But in the end, what are we left with? We're left with that transitional of space that becomes this absolute gray area that becomes very hard to translate. And kind of skipping around on my slideshow here for a second, but one of the other things is I skipped around too far. Sorry. I have over here simplicities and authentic trinkets in Greece. And these authentic trinkets, those are over in the Agora. And I actually took that photo when I was walking around with George. And George is a multi-generational owner of a leather shop. And he actually has 2 stalls. And he's one of the few vendors that has 2 stalls in the Agora itself. And I mean, he's very proud to tell you that. And what I call a Georgism, he will tell you all kinds of, little local lore about the Agora, about how the Agora shops have never gone out of business and they've never gone under. They pass from generation to generation. And oftentimes you'll see that, a few generations in, they'll reinvent themselves, but they stay within the same family hands by and large. And at the same time, I remember I looked at him and I said, George, please don't come at me for this. And then I had to explain to him, well, what come at me means, because it doesn't translate very well. And I was all, but these aren't Greek things. I said, this is a tacky t-shirt. And what I did not put a photo up here because it's not safe for work is the wooden male genitalia on keychains. Those I have a few photos of those, and they're very large, and you see people waving them around, and I was like, this is not a traditional Greek kind of item. And we're at that point we stopped and we got beverages, and he was like, you're right, but he goes, most people aren't going to be like you. They want to take home their t-shirt. He goes, pretend like you're 20 again. And that is exactly what it comes back to. We all have to have our little tchotchke to bring home. But at the same time, you've got the simplicity of life. And this is what the other photograph is of the salt. And that is, this picture is actually going into a new project that I'm working on about. I'm looking at the international space of grocery stores. And this is the simplicity. We're sold on the simplicity of life of Greece, and how, particularly the coastlines of Greece and Turkey, how they're so invigorating and relaxing. And with that, you go into these stores and you have such a simplistic display of salt. That's something that's so basic and we use almost every day in our cooking. And with that, if you go into an American grocery store, the salt display is not going to look like that. We have a lot more colors to our salt, a lot more different sizes and varieties. And I mean, you can go to Trader Joe's and get the lemon pepper salt, and then I can go to Emporium Foods, which is a chain in New York City. And there, I live in a largely Hispanic neighborhood. So I'm going to have everything from red flavored salts, they have spices in them, to regular salt itself. And one of the striking things here is that you see that the salt, it remains like localized national brands or regional brands. Whereas in the States, you have anything under the sun. And that's something that struck me. And as I asked people, sometimes I ask tourists, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I asked, the people that I interviewed, the shopkeeper in Rhodes, well, she's not really a shopkeeper, she's the hotel keeper in Rhodes, Denti, she looked at me and she said, that's because we don't have to have so much. And I looked at her and I said, you mean more like minimalism? And she said, no, I mean that we don't have to have so much, that we focus more on the value of life than on the quantity of goods. And so I stood there and I thought about that. And as I looked at her, she said, go out into a neighborhood that's not part of the city center. And it is true. Like the first year I lived right on the edge of Athens. And the farther you go out from the city center, you will see you get more displays like this in the grocery store. The grocery stores become a little bit bigger. And then at the same time, while it is pretty common to know English, English will be spoken less and less. They will speak it for you, but maybe not as fluently, or they might just force you into using what little Greek you know or the Greek you have. And with that, I think that all goes back into this kind of intangible space that I've been trying to flush out of this material, is that how do we quantify what tourism is? And when I started this project, like I said, Bodrum, started out from Turkey, and it was Izmir and Bodrum and a little bit of Ankara, that shopkeepers wanted to tell me about their daughters. And they wanted to tell me about passing these shops down to their daughters, whereas George didn't want to tell me about passing the shop down to his family. He wanted to tell me about the history of the area and the culture of the area. Whereas on the other side, in Turkey, I get a lot more of the, let me tell you about my daughter. And part of that is a culturalism, but part of it is, I will say that people are not necessarily willing to go on the record, but they will tell you things off the record. And that comes from a lot of stigma. They're afraid that someone's going to come after them or come after their job. And they will tell you off the record that it's a sales tactic. It's a number one sales tactic. Let me tell you about my daughter. And let me tell you about not being able to marry off my daughter, or how my sons went off to university and my daughter stayed behind, or how my daughter has kids of her own and we have to provide for them. Because it plays upon that gendered nature of life and how you provide for a woman and a woman provides for the family. Whereas on the other side, men are expected to take care of themselves. And so as I've been progressing through this, I keep asking, is tourism a male space or is it a female space? And that's one of those things that I think it really matters in how we look at this. And I'm not saying that we should look at it, as in a gendered pronoun per se, but think of it more in how tourism takes care of a community and how it takes care of a locale. For instance, in Bodrum, that fishing village isn't known for the fishing village anymore. Now it's known for the resorts, and particularly for that season of the year. And in Bodrum, we were talking before we started here about, we can tell growth of an area by the water pressure. And in Bodrum, they have that same problem. In the summer, the water pressure gets weaker. And a big part of it is they funnel the water pressure in from outside Bodrum Center so that the tourists have the most amount of water. Very similar to how you'll see in Cancun, Mexico, how the better resources are reserved for the tourists. And this is the same kind of concept that you see if you go to Jamaica, or like if you go to Ecuador, and if you go to a fast food restaurant, the kind of chickens that are sold there are not the same kind of chickens you're going to have at the local restaurants, because why? They're selling the bigger chickens to the tourist. And that way, so they can sell that American ideal of the big fat, fried chicken leg. And all of this comes back down to the fact of, if we're going into an area to relax is one thing, but if we're going into an area to get a glimpse of a culture and to get a glimpse of an escapism, then how much of it is authentic? Particularly because as tourism grows and hotspots grow, particularly with social media, you'll see that it's becoming harder and harder to contain tourism. In Greece, before the pandemic hit, starting in 2019, there were talks and there was actually mandates to start regulating tourism in specific areas, particularly Santorini and Mykonos, and that is because it becomes so overcrowded and just unbearable there in the summer. And this year, by July 1st, Santorini had sold out for the season. And that's because Greece went back for 2022, they exceeded the 2019 levels of tourism. And like I said, it was very crowded this year, but you could also tell that there was an exuberance to have the tourism back. And of course, with that, with inflation, prices were higher. And this is a push of tourism, even when Europe had an all-time high crisis on flights this summer, of being able to, have the staffing to manhandle their flights and get flights out in a timely manner. And so as we flush through all of this, a lot of my photos are from when it was a lot, I would call it kind of isolated, from 21. But with that, you see over here, sorry, I get trigger happy on my finger. I do this when I teach too. So Plaka with Athens. These are the stairs of Plaka, and this is considered the most Instagrammable spot in Athens. I lucked out. I got one of probably the only photos you'll get where you don't have scores and scores of people sitting on pillows on the stairs having coffee, and that's because it was in 21. This year I went back and there was a line to get up the stairs. And I have to say that I walked up there and I realized what the line was for, and I was like, oh no. But at the same time, why is it that we focus on something that's a constructed space? Were those Plaka stairs always so popular? No, it wasn't until Instagram made them popular. Santorini and Mykonos have been popular hotspots since the late 70s, but it's really been in the past 10, 15 years that Instagram and social media took them to the next level, because they became the it spot, particularly for those with money and those of wealth. And on that same note, then you have little postcard vignettes like you have over here, and then you have the continual crafted display. This corridor right here, there's actually a little funny story on that. A friend of mine, he showed me a photo of him and his wife taken there probably a good 15 years ago. And when I was walking around on Nahus, which is his favorite spot, I was like, oh my gosh, I took a photo of that. And I was like, I think I found your little photo spot. And it is. And I never realized from the photo he showed me, in which you can't really see here until you go up underneath those, but those are fake flowers. And they're kept there because it's a photographic spot. And so it brings people in because there's empty tables right there, but right behind me was a few diners. And that's what it's about. You see, the corridors are consistently kept up, so they're made to be picturesque and ideal, so that you constantly bring in that foot traffic. And, the rest of these slides are on that same note about how we sell those trinkets and how much of these trinkets are a natural space. And with me, I'm looking at the factor of the women, and in some regards, as I go deeper into this, I do have a lot of data on that. They're particularly rural communities, and Izmir, you'll see that women, they kind of have access to jobs, because like in Turkey, you're seeing that they're weaving rugs, and predominantly men do weave rugs, but predominantly the rugs are woven by women in rural communities. And that's how they gain access to the outside world, is by talking on these tours that come through. I went on a very, very strange tour there years ago, and I ended up conversing with about a 16-year-old, and she was very fascinated that I was out by myself, because I was, it was a private tour and it just happened to work out that way. And that I was out by myself. And it mirrored a conversation that I published an article on years ago about some college students in Turkey that were very fascinated that I was traveling by myself. And with those college students, we talked about the fact that in the United States, we don't go to Starbucks on a date. Like, we might go after a date, but not on a date. Why are we going to go to Starbucks? And they were so deflated. They thought that that's what we did, because it's so expensive there. And I was like, oh, I felt so bad for crushing their soul. And for that 16-year-old at the rug weaving community, she was so fascinated that I could go out by myself, that I wasn't afraid. And she had the same conversation those other girls did. She's like, well, what do you do when you're at home? She goes, how do you cook? Do you cook? And she was very fascinated to know that I cook. And she wanted to know if I drank a lot of Coca-Cola, because that was their big thing to give the tourists. And so in that regard, as I talk, I kind of talk smack about the tchotchkes over there, but we all have our tchotchkes. There's this constant thing about that Western good. And so how much of that Western good has to be sold to us, and how much of us do we want to buy the Eastern good? And that dividing line and that dividing space, like we still want to go see the old world market, but at the same time, do we care how much it's been gentrified, like Sultanate in Istanbul? So I have it open for questions for you guys now. I talked a little bit longer than I intended. There's a lot of chats over here. Oh yes, Heather, I'm sorry. I know we're all adults here, but I didn't know how to read the room today, so I decided to play it very, very safe.
You could have just given a trigger warning, right? You know.
True. It was one of those things I was like, you know, this is one of the, I'm gonna play it safe. It's also, I know some people are on the other side of the country, so it's like 7:30 their time. Might be too early in the morning for that image.
Do you find that some of the older art forms, like traditional rugs or traditional what have you, crafts, are those art forms changing or dying because they're trying to produce like a westernized or tourist friendly version of the product?
They are, actually. I have a piece of lace that I picked up in Cyprus. And I mean, it's a dying art there. Like a friend of mine, we joke, she's got rights to some property there from her family. And I was like, well, I can teach you, because I do handcraft. I was like, I can teach you how to make some lace. I was like, we could go make a decent living on this, but we're both kind of like, do we want to do that? But it is dying in things like the lace production, because what they have left is considered, you know, you have the UN stickers on them now because they are considered, you know, artifacts, I guess you could say. And the same thing with the rug making. The rugs are becoming harder and harder to come by, particularly with the machines. And I have one that was hand done, but at the same time, it's 3 sample rugs that were sewn together to make an affordable rug. And that's because they're losing that skill set. Same thing with the old ceramics. Now you're seeing them made by machines too. And it's also because people don't necessarily want to pay for that, the hand value of something. They see, you know, like they see that a mug is $35 US when it should be, when they think that, oh no, that should be like $7 because that's what they're going to buy in a mass produced store. So it is changing. Exactly.
Well, and I would wager it's probably European wide, because I know I ordered a mug for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee that was handcrafted in England, and it was $39. So it's right on the par for actually ordered 2 different ones. And you know, I'm a British historian, so you know, I have to have all the trinkets. But you know, it's a different, that you want something artisanal that's made in country versus something that is, you know, mass produced in China. And I think that's any place that relies on tourism, be it in New York City, which is a huge tourist draw because you live there. How many of the things there are made elsewhere? But like, you know, I live in Louisiana, and you know, there's a lot of tourism in Louisiana, you know, New Orleans and those places. And other than the food, so much stuff is mass produced elsewhere than, you know, not necessarily produced in state. And that's, and I wonder if it would transpose like with the idea of doing the Coca-Cola versus the regional, you know, people come to Louisiana to try the food. And so there's a big deal talking about using authentic, like Louisiana shrimp, Louisiana crawfish, instead of stuff coming from China. But
I did
so it
that.
would be interesting to see, like, as a corollary, like look at
Well, I did
food tourism.
a piece on Turkey, that Starbucks one, and a big section of that was on the Turk Cola. And I gotta tell you, like, and this was back when Chevy Chase did this really hilarious commercial that, you know, he drank Turk Cola and all of a sudden it made him Turkish. And that was the whole hook of it. And he started speaking Turkish and ate tomatoes. And it was quite funny. But the thing is when you go to Turkey and you go into a sit down restaurant, they're going to give you Coca-Cola, particularly in the city centers, and it's considered, you know, like a lowbrow kind of thing to drink the Turk cola. And I remember I looked at my friends and I'm like, but this is your national brand. And they're like, yeah, but it's not the same as Coca-Cola. And that's actually what led to that whole thing. And it's exactly what you're saying, Heather, that, you know, we go to a place to try the food, right? Like you go to Turkey to eat the food, but you're served a Coca-Cola. And I've seen that elsewhere too. Like Ecuador, they were real big on feeding us like Pepsi and Cokes rather than the local beverages.
But to be fair, Coca-Cola outside the United States doesn't have high fructose corn syrup in it, so it usually tastes better.
Because I will say it's a little bit crack. It tastes a lot better.
That was very fascinating. I can't wait to read more of your work, Annessa, and, you know, just hear the way you're pulling apart some of these different aspects of the tourist space itself and the culture of the shop owners and things like that. I mean, just really interesting work. So thank you for presenting that.
Thanks. Like I said, it's a little bit different than what I started out. I thought it was going to be a lot more straightforward, and instead I had to complicate things.
Well, those turn out to be the best research projects, right?
They do. I will say that.
Some good comments in the chat about Fanta.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. Look at the pineapple Fanta over in Europe right now too. That's the big rage.
Or melon Fanta in Japan. Oof, it's so good. Top tier.
Melon, so I'll trust you on that one.
It's so good.
Well, thank you everyone for coming this morning, and thank you to Annessa for sharing your work. I look forward to seeing your next article.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.